Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's research seminar at the Centre for Protecting Women Online at the Open University. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Asia Eaton, who will be speaking today on platforms as crime scene, judge and jury. To give a brief introduction for Dr. Eaton, she's a feminist social psychologist and professor of psychology at the Florida International University, where she directs the Power, Women and Relationships Lab. Her research focuses on gender, power and technology-facilitated violence, with particular expertise in image-based sexual abuse and the ways institutions and technologies respond to online harm online. Today's talk brings together findings from two complementary studies examining how online platforms respond to reports of non-consensual intimate imagery, including an audit of reporting systems on X, formerly known as Twitter, and interviews with victim survivors about their experiences navigating platform reporting processes. I'll hand over to Asia now. We'll have time for questions at the end. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eaton.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great, wonderful. It is great to be back at the Open University. I had the pleasure of serving as an international visiting fellow there last summer. I see many familiar names in the chat, and looking forward to having a conversation with you all. So yes, today I'm going to be talking about two studies, one qualitative and one quantitative, that get at the same question essentially. How platform reporting systems compound the harm of image-based sexual abuse. The first one is an audit study of Twitter, well, formerly Twitter, now X, where we posted AI-generated deepfake abuse and reported it under two different mechanisms. And the question primarily was, what gets removed and how fast? The second study is a qualitative study with 13 victim survivors of image-based sexual abuse. And we asked, what does the reporting experience actually feel like for victim survivors? What is their experience like on these platforms? What do they want changed? So a little bit about me. As I said, I had the pleasure of being an international visiting fellow at OU last summer. I am also a professor of psychology at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. But I am on leave from that position right now to be the executive director of a nonprofit called MindBridge, which is the nation's leading nonprofit using brain and behavioral science to do human rights work. So we use psychology and neuroscience to help human rights defenders do work that's more efficient and impactful. Everything from teaching them about how to help human rights defenders heal from burnout, to how to persuade audiences to recycle or vote. It's a really amazing organization. And I actually started it last summer also. I am also the head of research for Cyber Civil Rights Initiative and have been doing that since 2016. They're the nation's leading nonprofit that is looking to understand and end technology-facilitated violence with a special focus on image-based sexual abuse. The co-authors of the studies that I'll be talking about today are listed here, and the primary architect, the genius behind them, really is Qiwei. I was hoping she might be able to join us, but I think she's not able to, but hopefully you can let her in case she comes mid-talk. So my work, as you already know, centers gender-based violence and image-based sexual abuse and the legal, technological, and cultural systems that shape how victim survivors are treated when they seek help. So what is non-consensual intimate imagery? I don't really need to introduce the concept to this group, so I'll be brief here, but it sits on the continuum of sexual abuse harms. It is when imagery is created, intimate imagery is created of someone without their consent. So upskirting and downblousing, for example, when it is obtained without consent, and or distributed without consent. It also includes threatening to create or distribute intimate images of someone without their consent. Typically committed by someone known to the victim, and it exists within the same patterns of gendered power and coercion as other forms of sexual abuse, and produces psychological, economic, physical, social harms also comparable to other forms of sexual violation. So it's understanding it's part of a continuum rather than a lesser separate category, and warrants the same seriousness in legal, clinical, and social and technological responses. We are constantly getting updated information about how prevalent image-based sexual abuse is. Just recently, a 10-country study, including the US, found that more than 1 in 5, or 22.6% of respondents, reported being victimized by image-based sexual abuse. That's higher than when I first started studying this in 2016, 2017, where it was like, 1 in 8. Victimization rates are higher among groups already marginalized and already at risk for violence. So LGBTQ individuals, younger respondents, women. There's also evidence that women may experience greater harms and negative impacts from IBSA than men. But to be fair, I have also done research on image-based sexual abuse among men victim survivors. I don't consider that a lesser form of abuse or experience of abuse. And there are some forms of image-based sexual abuse, like sextortion, for example, that may be targeted at men at higher rates. I have some research looking at a large US sample from during COVID-19, where men were reporting greater experiences with sextortion than were women. But like most forms of sexual violence, across all forms of image-based sexual abuse, women seem disproportionately targeted. Then we have deep fakes, which are almost all targeted toward women, and almost all of which are non-consensual. This is not ordinary harassment. The content can be copied, re-uploaded, resurfaced indefinitely long after the original perpetration or perpetrator is gone. So it has incredible persistence. I have heard victim survivors say that PTSD is not a accurate description for the kind of trauma that victims experience, because it's not post anything, it's ongoing. And Claire McGlynn has great work showing that, image-based sexual abuse can create existential harms and really persistent harms. Algorithms amplify the spread, and a single post can become hundreds across platforms in a matter of hours. It's a bodily violation, again, structurally closer to physical sexual assault than to like defamation. And the harms are potentially compounded by, in the US in particular, a failure to have well-funded, anticipatory, victim-centered responses. So it can be compounded by problems in the legal system, problems with platforms that I'll discuss today. It's also often accompanied by other forms of abuse, like doxing, networked harassment, impersonation, and so on. Okay, so the first study I'm going to talk about is an audit study of reporting of non-consensual intimate media, which is what it was called in this particular paper, on X, but it was all sexualized deepfake abuse. We posted 50 entirely AI-generated deepfakes, reported them in 2 ways, and then watched what happened. And my colleagues are, for the most part, computer scientist colleagues. So we had very different approaches to this. And ultimately, I think the paper was incredibly clear. Both the results and the actual reading of the paper was less jargony than I am used to in psychology. So I believe a lot of practitioners and advocates have been able to read and make use of the paper, even though it was just recently accepted for publication. We put it on like a open website maybe a year ago, and people have been accessing it since then. But it is officially published in a computer and human interaction conference, I believe. All right, so on X back in 2024, when we did this, there were 2 ways to report image-based sexual abuse. You had 2 takedown options. One was to use X's non-consensual nudity policy, which was an internal community guideline. This was before the Take It Down Act, which criminalizes federally knowingly publishing intimate images without consent. This was before that. We had a patchwork of different laws across states, and there was no federal law. It was just an internal community guideline. Minimal, no federal backing, and it was something we were curious about. To what extent does X adhere to its own internal policies compared to adhering to DMCA copyright claims? That was a federal law. Platforms were required to comply, but it was not designed to address sexual abuse, and only applies to images where the victim has the copyright, and they have to, report their full name, their street address. Oh, Kue is there. Kue, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much for joining.
Great timing.
Great timing. I was just starting to talk about your audit study, and I'd love to have you jump in at any point, because I was a consultant. I have participated in writing the paper, but you saw it from the ground up, and may have more detailed knowledge of methods, for example, than me.
I'm happy to do it.
Okay, great. Thank you for joining.
And you played such a big role in this.
Thank you. Okay, so we had these 2 ways to take down image-based sexual abuse. One with federal protections, one was an internal policy guideline, but the federal protections only apply if you have the copyright, and you have to fill out additional forms. So we wanted to empirically test how effective each of these were. And we did that by first generating 5 unique AI-generated nude images of fictional personas. So each of these were entirely AI-generated, and each face was verified against reverse image search and fake facial recognition tools to confirm it didn't match a real person. All the images were of white women in their 20s and 30s, because we know from other research we've done that there are intersectional biases related to race or sexual identity, perhaps, that may affect takedown rates. So we wanted to control for the gender of the victim survivor, the race of the victim survivor, and the age of the victim survivor. We then created 10 new poster accounts. These poster accounts were extremely similar in terms of names, account age, types of accounts that they each followed. You can read the paper for more detail on how we tried to make those comparable. And with these 10 poster accounts, we posted 5 images per account to X. Of those, we then had reported 25 under DMCA copyrights and 25 under X's non-consensual nudity policy. Same images reported 2 different ways, variety of images to try to get some, different stimuli, just in case there was something about one of the stimuli that was going to relate to a much longer or a much quicker takedown process. But different mechanisms. Those reports were made by 5 reporter accounts, and each reported 10 total posts. Then we measured time to removal, number of views, reposts and engagement, and poster consequences. And the monitoring window was 21 days, after which we stopped the experiment. And the results are pretty shocking. Same images, same platform, same reporter behavior, only the legal label was different. 0 of the images that we reported under Twitter's non-consensual nudity policy were removed within that 21-day period. They were still live when we ended the study. 100% of the images reported under the DMCA law were removed. On average, they were removed after like 20 hours. And more than that, the copies of the same image came down within minutes of each other. So that was another sort of curiosity we had, is if we report an image on a particular thread from a particular poster, are identical images removed? With DMCA, they were. So again, the fastest was done in 13 hours, and the slowest was just a day. On top of that, all 5 poster accounts for the images that we posted under DMCA were restricted, temporarily restricted. And posters, which was us, were emailed a copy of the full DMCA notice. And but it included the reporter's real name and address, which was a major privacy risk for victim survivors. With the non-consensual nudity reports, nothing happened, no account suspensions, no warnings emailed to posters, no acknowledgement to reporters. Content was still live after 21 days. So what does this tell us? X has the capability of taking these images down swiftly and confronting perpetrators. It's just wasn't using it in 2024 for non-consensual intimate imagery. So it wasn't about technical capacity. It was about legal liability. But as I said, copyright laws were not intended to address sexual harm. They were intended to, help people, protect people's financial and commercial interests, right? This is not a victim-centered law. There's a lot the study can't tell us, right? We used images depicting young white women. What would have happened if we had survivors of color? We only audited X, and it was in 2024, which was before the Take It Down Act was passed. And again, in the US, the Take It Down Act makes it a federal crime to knowingly publish intimate images without consent. Now, it does have an intent to harm clause. It says that, in order to prosecute, you have to show either intent to harm or actual harm, but it allows for psychological harm, financial, reputational, and, I've been an expert witness in cases where I had to demonstrate psychological harm to victims, and it's not hard, unfortunately. It's pretty evident. Importantly, not only is it a crime, but this act requires platforms to take down the content within 48 hours, along with all copies of the content. The act was passed like a year and a day ago, literally, May 19th, 2025, and platforms had a year to establish the required notice and removal processes. So as of yesterday, we have to be seeing compliance, and I don't know what it's like. That's a study for another day. A couple of other limitations of the study. A lot of the accounts, they were all brand new with no followers, right? And maybe the response would have been different if these had been more popular accounts. And we didn't capture the human cost, either to the potential victim survivors or to the auditors. We did make efforts to ensure that we did not overtax the potential humans auditing this content, which is why we ended the study at a certain point. But there's also trauma experienced by those who have to process this content. So, we know about the platform behavior, but behind every report is a person. What's the personal experience of doing this reporting process? And for that, we ran a qualitative study. Although I want to pause here, and Kwiwe, is there anything you want to add about the first study?
I think that was a very thorough, thorough account of the first study. But if there are any questions about the first study, I feel like the first one usually gets a lot of very good and important questions about research ethics, about how we balanced harms, about how we decided which platform to edit, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, in the US, it's still legal to create sexualized deepfake abuse. It's illegal to disseminate it, but you can still create it. And the apps that enable you to do that exist and can be found through Google. So, this study might not have been possible to do in the UK. Even though we didn't use images of real people in creating these, we also don't know what the apps were trained on. They could have been trained on content that was non-consensual. So there are a lot of ethical considerations for this. But as in any study, we weighed the potential benefits of the study findings against the potential harms, and decided that this is extremely important information for platforms and victim survivors to know. All right, so our interview study. We interviewed 13 victim survivors for around 2 hours each. They were pretty long interviews. And we tried to make the interviews as trauma-informed as possible, which I'll describe in more detail in a minute. We asked them about their experiences of the takedown process, covering platforms not, in addition to X. So the second study, platforms as crime scene, judge, and jury. we ended up using a lens of institutional betrayal. So institutional betrayal theory was developed by psychologists, Jennifer Freyd, I guess is how you say her last name, and Carly Smith, I think.
Yes,
And it describes the harms caused when institutions that people depend on and trust fail to protect them or to respond to wrongdoing committed within them. So, this theory has been examined in places like schools, the military, churches, and betrayal can take a variety of forms, right? Covering up assaults, retaliating against whistleblowers, creating environments that normalize abuse, making victims feel disbelieved, okay? And research finds that institutional betrayal compounds the psychological harm of an original traumatic event. So on top of, the original trauma, there is additional uh, psychological pain and higher rates of anxiety and depression and sexual dysfunction among those who not only experienced the violation, but experienced institutional betrayal around it. And this is, I think, to our knowledge, one of the first studies to apply this to online platforms, to treat platforms as an institution that
I think
could,
it's the first one.
yeah, that could be complicit in perpetrating harm. And you've got to remember, like, these institutions, people really do trust these places. And they use them for a variety of personal things. People use them for blogging and to keep up with family. And, they send consensual, intimate content through these platforms. And, rely on these platforms for news. So they really do trust in these platforms. And that puts them at risk for institutional betrayal. It's usually measured using a version of the institutional betrayal questionnaire, which asks things like, did this institution punish respondents in some way for reporting their experience? Or did they deny the experience in some way? Or did they create an environment in which this type of experience was common or normalized? So we ended up not using a questionnaire, but listening deeply to 13 participants who identified as victim survivors of image-based sexual abuse. We recruited people who were adults, age 18 and older, although I think some might have reported experiences that occurred during their adolescence.
Yes, at least 30% of them did.
Okay. We focused on US-based participants because at the time, there were still some big holes in legal frameworks governing IBSA perpetration. And of course, the treatment of content on these platforms varies across countries. So we kept that constant. We recruited people through social media by asking if they've had intimate videos or photos shared online without consent. So these were all shared online, as opposed to just through, I guess, like text messages or other ways you might disseminate. We also looked to university research listservs and some advocacy networks to recruit. So we had a sort of diverse recruiting strategy. The protocol for conducting the interviews was trauma-informed. It was designed in collaboration with trauma experts and advocates and in collaboration with victim survivors. So typically what trauma-informed protocol means is giving the participant or the victim survivor lots of autonomy and control over the process. And we gave them the opportunity to have a 15-minute chat with us beforehand so they could even decide if they wanted to participate. We made sure to have 2 interviewers in every session, a researcher and a trauma-informed crisis counselor. The format of the interview was up to the participant, if they wanted their camera on or off. And of course, there was member checking. And folks said that reading other people's stories was actually helpful to them.
I'll add a couple of details here about recruitment. We recruited initially through a survey where we asked how long ago did this happen to you? And one interesting thing that is not in the paper, but I found is that we actually had several people who were impacted specifically by AI NCII. But at the time, 2025 was a relatively new thing. So everyone that had been impacted by that had it happen less than a year ago, and they all indicated they were not ready to talk. So I think that's an interesting signal of people need to become ready. Another thing is that with the trauma-informed is, we still have to send consent forms. Consent forms can be long, and at least one participant initially was really scared off by the consent forms after going through a process, like a legal process that requires you to constantly be vigilant. So there's just things that we learned through this process about what trauma-informed really means for this group.
Thank you so much. All right, so what we found is platforms are failing victim survivors along 4 dimensions, and I'll talk about each one. The reporting is confusing and hostile. Complex violence is forced into these narrow drop-down menus. Responses are inadequate, meaning there's silence, there's delay, automated replies. Victim survivors are punished by having reports denied, by having their own accounts banned. And the violated expectations lead people to leave, which, as everyone here knows, is a threat not just to victim survivors' well-being, but to democracy and people's participation in public life. If you can't be online, you're not a full participant in a lot of ways in society. All right, so reporting, hostile and confusing. Often they had to pick between different types of experiences. Is it a sexual content violation or is it harassment? And they had to figure out which is going to be taken most seriously. Deleted messages couldn't be reported anymore. And reporting, required re-engaging with the abuse. You see a quote here from one participant who says, "It was triggering. I'm going through my phone. I have to look at pictures I don't want to look at. It was traumatizing to look at them again." Sometimes they had to screenshot their own photos from pornographic websites just to submit them again. Responses being inadequate or absent, a lot of delays and silence, during which the content stayed up, right? And kept accumulating views or downloads. There was no human contact, automated opaque replies, and some accounts, sometimes the content was removed, sometimes the accounts were suspended, not always. And then the perpetrator comes back and can post again. As you can see in the quote at the bottom, it says this participant said it was a never-ending cycle. The websites would realize the photos were taken down and just upload them again. Reporting itself became punishment because victim survivors had to deal with often multiple platforms. They had to see the images again. They had to relive the experience. And often they were denied, or the reporter herself was banned. In one case, a participant was banned for teen self-endangerment while she was reporting child sexual abuse material solicitation against her. She says, "Don't ban me first without telling me the situation has been taken care of. I'm technically the victim here." You should also deal with the perpetrator. So the reporting experience, and anyone who works with victim survivors knows they will tell you this, but now we have it, in a more rigorous and codified way. The reporting process is traumatic. And yeah, people left. Platforms where life happened, where people were blogging or, getting their news or seeing their friends, were abandoned. And, participants assumed platforms had powers beyond law enforcement because, the platforms, they're so ever present in our lives. They're a vehicle through which so much happens. We don't usually have a lot of contact with law enforcement. And so you figure like this is the responsible party. They're going to do something. And that just wasn't always the case. So they, left platforms they had poured years of their lives into. One participant said, fuck Meta. I don't believe in anything they're doing anymore. What did victim survivors actually ask for? Just tell them what's happening. Even a regular confirmation of inaction, for some of them can beat waiting in silence for weeks. Transparent communication was very important. Access to a real human was important. They asked for us to have a process closer to DMCA, where, they're believed first, and the removal is swift. They asked for sanctioning the perpetrator, and they said, why are we having to do this over and over and over across platforms? And obviously there are tools like Stop NCII that help to address some of that, but not every platform is participating in that program. Anything else, Kwiwe?
One interesting thing about what victim survivors asked for is that they wanted both more technology and they wanted more humans. They wanted humans to deal with the emotional support part, especially the minors who didn't have other adults in their lives that could play the role. And they wanted the technologies to take care of things that technology is already good for, like automation. So it's really not one or the other. It's a mix of both, but that mix has to be done right.
Yeah, these are not radical demands. These are things other industries have solved, right? Okay, so again, take home message, capacity exists. Will to address the problem is selective and dependent on, well, until the Take It Down Act, platform goodwill. And, the other finding is that the harm of non-consensual intimate images can come from the platform itself, from the experience of being betrayed by a platform that you trusted to help you. So like I said, in the US, we now have the Take It Down Act, where that specifies you have to remove non-consensual intimate images within 48 hours. As of yesterday, it's enforced by the FTC, but I find it still kind of vague. So it says like you can't publish images. I don't know how that's interpreted. It doesn't specify how reasonable efforts will be measured to take it down. Go ahead.
Yeah, there are some very lively debates about the Take It Down Act. On one end, you have the vagueness like Asia is talking about. For example, one thing that it asks is that not only does there need to be an easy way for people to report content, the websites also have to prevent identical re-uploads. And that'll probably be done with a hash system. But the issue is, well, a lot of these uploads are not going to be identical. And even just downloading an image can change it, and it's going to have issues. Another type of like controversy with Take It Down Act is that there's issues with censorship, as in people have concerns with censorship. What if someone makes a political content that happens to be sexual in nature? Should that stay up or down? That is, well, a lot of people think that the law could be used to overreach for free speech also, that it wasn't ever intended to help survivors, and that it was meant to protect classes of politicians instead. So there are some very interesting things as this rolls out yesterday, and we're seeing what's actually happening.
Yeah. I'll also say 48 hours may sound quick. It's not. Online content peaks within 30 hours. Popular hashtags lose attention after 17 hours. There's a lot of harm that can be done in 48 hours.
I remember one survivor said after submitting the report, they just stay on their laptop and they refresh, waiting for it to come down.
All right, so this points to some concrete design changes. Take the content down on report and review afterward. I don't actually know what I guess it's a free speech opposition to this.
It would be someone acting in bad faith. If someone says imagine someone shares consensual nudity, but other people are not happy with it, and they pose as them and send a bad faith report saying it's them, then anyone that, like a sex worker that would be the concern there.
Yeah, and I do know that in I think it was 2022, X in particular allowed, consensual intimate imagery to be posted on their platform.
I think they do, and it's just so hard to know, like, how do you define consent, something that's so complex and nuanced when it's just applied in these ways.
Yeah. Letting reporters describe the violation in their own words is something that they asked for. Not making them choose one of 6 options on a drop-down menu, cross-platform reporting infrastructure, communicating at every stage, not just removing the post, but sanctioning the perpetrators and using the technology that already exists with DMCA takedowns to address non-consensual intimate images. So some recommendations for policy. I said this at the beginning, Kwiwe, when you were just coming in, that the US is behind other countries in addressing this issue. The Independent Office for Online Safety is something we need and could be modeled after existing institutions. We need to set more standards, be more clear in the law, and have external oversight so that platforms don't stay crime scene judge and jury. All right, these are the 2 studies presented today, and they are both available online and both published, right, officially?
Yes, both are published. The first one has been accepted to be published, and the second one was published at CHI, or Human Factors in Computing, this year.
Awesome. We have some resources for victim survivors at the bottom, and are happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Eaton. That was a really fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I think there's a lot for us to reflect on, particularly around like platform capabilities and accountability, victim survivor experiences. We now have some time for some questions, and there haven't been any submitted yet, but while we're waiting on questions, I have a couple. Firstly, in terms of the first study, which I think was super interesting and quite shocking in terms of how quickly and seriously DMCA is taken. Firstly, it's a methodological question around why X specifically was chosen as opposed to potentially doing this research on Instagram or other social media platforms.
Yeah, I can answer that one. Our criteria for picking a platform is that it had to allow nude content. Instagram would have taken it down under their taken nude content down under their other existing policies. Anyhow, another one we considered was Reddit. There were two reasons why Reddit didn't make sense for this study. One is that Reddit, as we know, uses real human moderators, and we didn't want to add. We really thought about the ethics of adding that extra burden to the moderators who would have to deal with real tickets. And another issue is that a lot of times the subreddits for posting pornography on Reddit actually requires karma specific to the subreddit. So you have to be a participating member in that subreddit in order to do so. And so it wasn't feasible. I mean, I even tried buying Reddit accounts, but it wasn't feasible for us to participate in these pornographic accounts, subreddits in order to post. But that doesn't stop, of course, abusers from doing so in these subreddits.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. It looks like we have a question from Natalie Mitchie, who says, as you mentioned, image-based abuse is on a continuum of violence against women and girls. How would you frame this non-consensual image abuse as an extension of patriarchal structures?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is increasingly being used to silence women in public spheres. You know, I have a paper right now under review that describes how it is also a form of objectification and can lead victim survivors even to engage in self-objectification, which is harmful. So it has this intent to silence women, to reduce them to bodies, and take away their voices. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you. And we have another question from, I think it's Mira McCanman, who thanks you for the talk and asks, for those of us thinking carefully about how to develop trauma-informed protocols in doing qualitative research with victim survivors, were there methodological choices that you wanted to make initially that you ultimately abandoned after further collaborative discussion, or perhaps after engaging with your institution's ethical review board?
That's a really good question. Let me think for a second. I think the answer is yes, but I might have to think a bit more about how we choose to recruit. One thing we thought through carefully that Asia and I discussed was part of our recruitment was through social media, and we made an Instagram ad. And so we wanted to choose the language on that Instagram ad very carefully to make sure that, because victims tend to self-exclude, we didn't want to put the word, honestly, victims on there. And so we tried to put the language quite broadly. Another thing is that doxing harassment is something that happens along with this type of abuse. And so we also made sure that people could put a pseudonym when we were referring to them, or we encouraged them to, if they weren't comfortable giving their email addresses, that they could make a new one that did not contain their name, or they felt safer using. So a lot of you have to consider it from the perspective of someone who really want to share their story, but have experienced traumas in those very particular areas of dealing with this.
Yeah, that's also really important things to consider. That was a question I actually had that I was going to ask around the ethics of the interviews. We have a further question.
Let me ask, did we do a suicidality screener at the beginning of the interview? Or did we decide against that?
I don't think I think we discussed it, but that did not make it into part of our.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from the audience. I've heard some people say with, traumatizing victims who are traumatized that it can be best practice to use a very short suicidality screener at the beginning and see if they are having any suicidal thoughts And, if they are, to direct them to resources, to not proceed with the interview, to schedule the interview for a different time. But I don't know, I have mixed feelings about that, and I'm not a clinician. So would love to know what other people think about that. I did that in some interviews with image-based sexual abuse victim survivors years ago. And one person did report having suicidal ideations. And we stopped the interview, directed them to resources. We said, can we follow up with you in the next few days? But they were very upset because they wanted the compensation that the study would provide immediately. And anyway, there's the issue of like people potentially faking, and that's a whole nother issue. But yeah, we didn't do that here.
Thank you. We have a question from someone who states that they've observed similar cases in their community, mostly on tech gender-based violence, and asks if you can advise on how to go about it in terms of, is there any mentorship opportunities for people seeking mentorship? Not sure. Not sure if that's in reference to victims or mentorship around people doing research in this area.
I would be happy to chat with researchers who are curious about how to go about this type of work. It's really I find it so fascinating that we need so much more people doing this work, but yet it's very hard to do it. I mean, there are strains on the researcher, and you have to have a certain level of care for ethics and compassion for the survivors. But if you have more questions, I'm very happy to talk to others offline. I put my email in the chat there. Another thing that came to mind about working with survivors is that when I tell like others, even researchers, that we're doing this type of study, so an often response is, that must be hard to recruit people who want to talk about this. People must not want to talk about this. But we found that to not be true at all. After we built some trust with the participants, they really love to tell their story. I mean, love is a weird word, but they really want to tell their story, because one reason is there's not any other safe way to do so and to reflect on it. And we've had several people come back and tell us that after talking about this and then after reading what we've written about others doing this, they feel better.
And we also have a question around if you've brought the research to the platforms or policymakers, and if you have, what their response has been.
We have brought this research to policymakers. We've forwarded it to Michigan, but at the time, well, this research is recently published, so now we'll be doing more of that. And I'll also be doing more into the Take It Down Act also.
And a couple more questions. Someone just asked to be reminded of how many participants were involved with the interviews. I think you said it was 13, wasn't it? Yes. And a further question, why did you choose the institutional betrayal framework, and how relevant do you think this framework is for the global South context, where women face a compounding failure, such as platforms having no jurisdictional accountability, state laws, etc.? Does institutional betrayal theory hold when both the platform and the backstop institutions are sites of betrayal simultaneously?
I don't have an immediate answer to that. I have a colleague who does wonderful work on Global South and particularly this issue, Amna Batul, Batool is her last name. So I believe she discusses this in her papers.
Was there, I mean, yeah, I suppose you explain this in the talk as well, but was there, the person also asked if there's a particular reason why that framework was chosen?
We started the study just wanting to know what is it like for survivors navigating the reporting system. And as with finding the framework, kind of when the right one appears, it kind of just all makes sense at once. So as we started to, I believe as we started to look at some of the initial interviews and explored frameworks, that one just really made sense because I had already had a sense that reporting was its own harm, that it dealing with the platform was already doing harm on its own, and institutional betrayal framework was talking exactly about that, and it gave us more leverage points that also just fit the problem space.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'll just check if any more questions have come in, although I acknowledge there's only a minute or so left of the talk. I don't think there are any more questions. I potentially for a final question, I wanted to ask, going back to the first study as well, in terms of DMCA and the Take It Down Act. Now that this is now in place, and as you say, as of yesterday, do you think platforms such as X will still take this sort of non-consensual sharing images as seriously as they do DMCA? It'd be interesting to do a further study to see whether it's 100% across both, or they still don't take it as seriously. I know you spoke about the vagueness of the wording, which I suppose would potentially allow for some them not to take it seriously.
I worry that they won't, both because these are, patriarchal institutions, but also because copyright is something that very large corporations, Disney, is extremely invested in and will sue for, and there will be there's massive numbers of people and corporate interest involved in making sure that that law is adhered to, whereas victim survivors, don't have that kind of financial power, that kind of like ear to the Congress. But Quiwe, what do you think?
I think it's the $1 million question right now. There's so many different interests that could be impacted by Take It Down. I mean, survivors is one, but unfortunately, like Asia said, there's only so much interest in that of survivors from the broader community. But the political aspect is another one. If it goes as some legal scholars are saying, there could be risk of over removal, but that could also mean that there's less attention paid to actual survivor reports. So I don't think anyone knows right now, but we'd be very curious to find out also.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to see how this develops going forward. Well, that's time, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to thank both Dr. Eaton and Kwewe in the really interesting talk. Yeah, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.